Today is the third Sunday in our sermon series, Women in the Bible. We're looking at a woman named Esther from the book of Esther. Esther is the queen, and her cousin Mordecai asks her to approach the king with a message. Listen for why Esther hesitates. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message for Mordecai, saying, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: all alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone, may that person live. I myself have not been called to come to the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. "Do not think that being in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this." Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything that Esther had ordered him. May God bless this reading to our understanding. When I was in college, my sorority sisters and I tried to time our classes so that we could always be present to watch our favorite soap opera. It fell over the lunch hour. All My Children aired at noon, and it was definitely worth the walk all the way back across campus to make it to the Tridelt house in time to sit on the sofa with all the others watching All My Children so that we could stay tuned to the unfolding drama. Now, if you had class or lab or some other commitment, you could miss a day or two, and then you could come back and catch up if you knew the characters. Today's scripture lesson reads a little bit like a soap opera, or maybe a mini-series about some kind of historical fiction, but you have to first know the characters. There are 4 main characters. Our heroine is Esther. She's a young Jewish orphan who has won at least one beauty pageant. Esther is known for her charming subtlety and her ability to think on her feet. Her name, Esther, means "I am hiding." Mordecai is Esther's cousin, and as a good Jewish family would be prone to do, Mordecai took Esther in and raised her as his own daughter after her parents perished. Now, maybe Mordecai's a little bit overprotective, but he does have Esther's best interest at heart. Both Esther and Mordecai are faithful Jews living as refugees in a foreign land in Persia. Next, we have the king of Persia. The king is pompous, outspoken, enamored with his own power, and displays no moral strength. He reigns over a time of enormous economic prosperity, but he tends to create chaos and go about following his own whims. He is a Gentile and has no interest whatsoever in the welfare of the Jewish people. And finally, our 4th character we have is Haman, also a Gentile from Persia, who is an insecure cabinet member in the king's court. He's a blowhard. He's hungry for power, and he doesn't care who he stomps on his climb for power. He longs to be the prime minister and call the shots for the king of Persia. Now, I would like to tell you that this story is G-rated. After all, it is in the Bible. And my colleague, Reverend Pam Bauer Nolan, says that preaching should always be G-rated. But this is one of those Bible stories that scrapes by with the PG-13. Now, if you're intrigued at all, go home and read all of Esther yourself. It's only 10 chapters, and I promise you will not fall asleep. Today, though, I'm going to oversimplify the plot to focus on this one particular moment in Esther's life. The king has a wife named Vashti, but when Vashti refuses to appear before the king and his comrades in her birthday suit at a beauty contest, Vashti is banished, done away with as queen. There's a need for a new queen, and that's how Esther is chosen to be the new king and the new queen. And the king has no idea that Esther is Jewish. All he cares about is that Esther is attractive. While Esther is living the good life and reigning as queen inside the palace, her cousin Mordecai comes to her and announces a dire warning. Haman has gotten the king to sign a decree to destroy every Jewish person living in Persia. A Holocaust has been planned. It is this evil cabinet member, Haman, who has convinced the king to wipe out all the Jewish people. Haman has gone so far as to already build the gallows to massacre Mordecai and all the other Jews. So Mordecai asks Queen Esther to intervene with the king and beg for a reprieve. Esther pushes back on Mordecai. Your plan, she says, your plan is too risky. Everyone knows that she does not have the customary right to approach the king. For her, the lowly wife, to get an audience with the king, to request that, to approach him, well, she could be put to death just for asking. But her cousin Mordecai pleads with her, and he says, if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another corner, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows, he says, perhaps you have risen to royal dignity for such a time as this. Esther is between that proverbial rock and a hard place. No matter what she does next, she could perish. Her people could perish. So Esther plans a banquet. She invites her husband, the king, to attend the banquet. She approaches him at the banquet. It sounds lovely, but in truth, we know that she had to be quaking in fear. She's nervous as all get out. She's risking her own life just to invite him. She knows she could easily land in the gallows. Esther holds her breath, and then she goes to make her request. She asks the king to save the Jewish people, to reverse his edict, and he grants a reprieve. The king learns the truth that this evil Haman has tricked him into this terribly horrible, evil edict. And so suddenly it is Haman who is on his way to the gallows, and Esther's courage saves her own life, her family's life, the life of her people. How do you and I find courage? When do we risk speaking up and stating the truth? When do we actively take a stand for what we believe is right? Esther's story reminds us that it's complicated, it's risky, it's frightening. Sometimes we, like Esther, tremble in fear, unsure of what our next move might be. If your boss asks you to do something that is unethical or illegal or just plain not right, do you follow the boss's orders, or do you say nope and risk losing your job? if you're at a cocktail party and someone tells a joke and you realize that joke is poking fun at people with mental illness, or people of another religion, or people who identify as trans, do you speak up? Because if you do, you might lose some friends. If you see something wrong in society, do you advocate for change, or do you zip your lips and look the other way? All of us need courage every day in thousands of different ways. But how do we practice courage? How do we muster the bravery to risk and speak and act when doing so may lead to our own downfall? Esther, you see, on the one hand, she's a vulnerable minority, and on the other hand, she sits in a privileged position. Esther's particular predicament reminds me of the real-life person named Bella DaCosta Green. Bella DaCosta Green was the personal librarian to the financial giant J.P. Morgan. Miss Green became the first director of the J.P. Morgan Library in New York City, which houses many rare books, manuscripts, and artifacts. Miss Green, in her day, in the early 1900s, became one of the most influential people in New York. She was well known in the international art scene across Europe, where she traveled collecting rare manuscripts and documents. But all the while she moved about in these privileged circles, she was keeping her true identity a secret. You see, Miss Bella DaCosta Green was African American, but her skin tone was so pale she passed as white. She always lived in fear at every meeting, at every encounter, at every social occasion. Someone might find out who she really was. And her story remained secret the entire time she worked there, even after her death. No one talked about her influence on the library. When it was revealed her true identity, the library had very little to say about it. But in recent months, they have opened a brand new exhibit honoring Bella DaCosta Green's influence on this incredibly world-famous library. Doesn't it seem like some people were just born with more courage than the rest of us? Where does it come from? I've been reading this true story about a woman named Virginia Hall who served during World War II. The title of the book is A Woman of No Importance. Virginia Hall was born into a well-to-do family in the United States. She went to various elite colleges on the East Coast, and then she traveled to Paris to study. She was engaged briefly to a very wealthy man, but she broke off the engagement and began traveling in Europe. And during World War II, she became a British spy. She ran a huge underground resistance network working against the Nazis during their occupation of France. Early in her life, Virginia was in a hunting accident and she lost the lower half of her leg. So she had this wooden leg and this slight limp. And so when she was involved in these risky spy ventures, she always knew that if something went wrong, she was not able to run. When she would go into a room, she would check instantly to see if there were 3 or 4 exits so that she could get away quickly because she was unable to run. And when the war intensified and some of her colleagues in this spy network were apprehended, taken hostage, or even killed, many times she was summoned both by the British and the Americans, come home, come home. It isn't safe for you to stay there. But she continued to fight for freedom. Mostly, Virginia Hall's story and how she worked so diligently and so bravely to save so many lives and to fight that war undercover has not been told. We don't know this woman of no importance was really a brave heroine. But one of my favorite parts of the book comes early on when she settles in Lyon, France, to set up this espionage network. And when she arrives, there's no place to stay. There's not a hotel room, there's not a hostel, there's not an apartment to rent. She has nowhere to sleep. So she climbs up into the hills and she goes to a convent and she knocks on the door, and the nuns let her come in and spend the night for several nights. And the nuns in the hills are her first recruits in the espionage network. And a week or so later, she recruits her second wave of leaders in the network. And the second recruit is the woman who is the madam of the local brothel. I love the idea that these women we think of as being of no importance, the nuns in the hills, the woman running the brothel, turn out to be the ones who were smuggling secret messages and weapons and food and rations to supply the spies of the Allied forces fighting Hitler's evil regime. Esther is one of only 2 books in the Bible named for a woman. The other book is the book of Ruth. 66 books in the Bible, 38 named for men. Why does Esther get her own book? Were the people so hungry to adopt her stance of courage in their own lives? To this very day, our Jewish brothers and sisters read the whole story of Esther, all 10 chapters, aloud every year on the Feast of Purim. They remember that Esther took a gigantic risk to save them, that they are here today because of her bravery and courage. Today's passage, the one we read from chapter 4, is the tipping point for Esther, where she realized that this was her moment. Mordecai begs her, "Don't keep silent. Who knows," he says, "maybe you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this." Then she gives Mordecai directions. "Go," she says, "gather up all the Jews. Ask them to fast from food and drink for 3 days, night and day." She invites them, you see, her whole faith community, to join her in a time of prayer and solidarity. Her courage is rooted not in her own individual strength alone, but in the collective strength of God's people, God's community. We need each other for courage. Esther shows us that courage comes not just from one person, but from the community in prayerful solidarity with one another. All of us will have an Esther moment. Maybe yours has already come. Maybe yours is still to come. Maybe it comes for you over and over again. A moment when our fear is overcome by our courage. Esther, just remember, Esther means I am hiding. But in the end, she did not hide. Will we